Hello and welcome to Get to the Point. My name is James Cordwell. Millions of people turn to organizations like the Food and Drugs Administration, that's the FDA in America, to gain assurances and that medications and products they use are safe and effective. The FDA was created in the early 20th century and was tasked with ensuring that the US consumer will be protected from unsafe and ineffective medications, equipment, and contaminated food. The FDA has had some success stories, such as blocking a morning sickness drug in the 1960s that caused birth defects, and the ongoing regulatory control of over-the-counter food and medications. The FDA has many times ensured that high quality standards have been achieved and high quality products delivered all the way to American homes. Now, the records show that it hasn't been particularly effective lately, but it has gotten much worse. Now, links between the FDA and Big Pharma are destroying the credibility of the FDA and similar organizations worldwide. Regulators who are not independent cease to provide the very protections they were meant to deliver. In this episode of Get to the Point, Big Pharma is corrupting the regulators. We ask how and why this has happened. When the FDA was founded, it was created because of issues. Poor quality over-the-counter medications or poor food standards led to deaths or serious implications for those involved. When it was created, it was 100% fully independent and centrally funded, and thus it worked only for the American people and was only accountable to the government executive. Now, one of the FDA's most shining successes occurred in the late 1950s when the agency refused to approve thalidomide. Now, unfortunately, other countries, including the UK, did. By 1960, 46 countries had allowed pregnant women to use thalidomide to treat morning sickness, but the FDA in the States refused on the grounds that the studies were insufficient to demonstrate safety. Debilitating birth defects resulting from thalidomide arose in Europe and elsewhere in 1961, was widely used in Britain between 1958 and 1962, and may have led to 10,000 miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths in Britain alone. Advertised as a wonder drug against morning sickness, the drug though had unknown side effects and caused severe birth defects. The former head of the Thalidomide Trust, that's Sir Martin Johnson, said that many families at the time would not have known their babies had even been affected by the drug. Virtually none of those who suffered miscarriages would have known, and that would have applied to around about 90% of those suffering stillbirths too. The babies were hidden and there was no birth defects register.
The other thing that we've identified over the last 7 years is the rate of deterioration in people's health, and that it really is quite alarming. We found that over a third of our people are living with chronic pain. That is, they're in pain most days, every day. And I came from a background in the hospice movement where my first thought was, well, we shouldn't just accept that people have to put up with pain and maybe take more medication. And so we started asking around, and we found that there are people in Germany and particularly in Sweden who'd also been working on this, and they'd come up with some solutions that could deal with some of the main causes of pain. And the main causes seem to be to do with people using their bodies excessively, such as, for instance, people with short arms bending their back all the time and creating pain in their shoulders and their back. And so we've had a big program of work this last 3-4 years to try and find ways we can improve the support for people with these problems through the NHS, through their physiotherapists, and setting up our own scheme to do this. And our attitude is that people should reasonably expect at the age of 45 or so to have another 30 or 40 years to live, and we don't think that they should have to expect that that should be just continuing pain. So one of our guinea pigs, I think I can say, is a lady who went through the Swedish process as a case study with us, and she'd already been told by her doctor and her consultant that the pain she was experiencing, that it was so bad she'd had to give up work, she was an office worker, was not going to go away, and the deterioration would get worse, and by the time she was 50 she could expect to be completely incapacitated. And that's really pretty scary news to hear when you're only 40, 42 years old. And she went through the process with the Swedes, and they followed the training they gave her, and within 2 to 4 weeks she was saying that her pain level was down by 80%, that it was a fantastic improvement, it was almost unbelievable. And we've since seen several more people experience that big improvement, but it means changes to their patterns of behaviour. And so this is where we're focusing. And so if we talk to people, for instance, about driving, one of the questions I'll now ask is, well, how long do you drive your car before it starts to hurt? Now, most able-bodied people don't have any idea that driving a car is going to cause you pain. But most of our people think, oh, it's normal, if I drive a car for an hour, then I'm going to be in pain, and, doesn't everybody experience that? And we say, well, no. You actually need to invest in changing your car so that the things that you're doing in your car are no longer damaging your body. And a typical thing would be somebody with short arms getting over a steering wheel with their head twisted back and their back away from the backrest, so that all the weight of their torso is going on the lower spine. And that's damaging the lower spine and the shoulders and the neck and the arms. And if people then are trained to go to a different way of driving and maybe use a joystick, then all of a sudden the pain goes away. And we had one of our ladies who really had hit the point of being temporarily completely incapacitated, unable to move through pain, flat on her back. And she went through the process, and she invested in having her car changed, and she was saying, it's astonishing, my pain has gone away, and I can drive all the way, for 3 hours, maybe London to Manchester kind of distance, and it still doesn't hurt. This is astonishing. I think one of our team worked with us as a consultant on our computer system 7 years ago, and he said, well, so you'll get a paperless toilet before you get a paperless office. And I said, well, actually, we've got 180 paperless toilets on our system, which we did at that point, and there's many more now. Because people don't think about how difficult it is to manage going to the toilet if your hands or arms stop there.
How did AIDS change how the FDA is funded? In the 1980s, the HIV crisis created fear all around the world, and people were angry that experimental treatments were taking time to be approved by organisations like the FDA. At that time, 3 to 8 years was normal for approval. In response to intense pressure and the environment of fear, Congress in the early 90s shifted how FDA was funded to, it said, encourage a faster FDA approval process. So instead of being fully taxpayer funded, the new process required the pharmaceutical companies themselves to fund part of the approval process. Why? Well, the idea was that the FDA could then afford to expand. So this was intended to be new money or additional money to hire more researchers and staff to speed up the process. However, in exchange for big pharma money, the FDA would have to set goal dates for drug reviews that were satisfactory to the drug companies themselves. Now, whilst being fully independent and funded only by the US government, About 21% of FDA-approved drugs carry black box warning labels. Black box warnings, also called boxed warnings, are required by the US Food and Drug Administration for certain medications that carry serious safety risks. Often these warnings communicate potential rare but dangerous side effects, or they may be used to communicate important instructions for the safe use of the drug. They appear printed in bold font, as you can see, surrounded by a black border on the insert that comes inside a medication's packaging and on the drug manufacturer's website if it has one. So how does a medicine get this warning? Well, the FDA often identifies safety concerns with medications through clinical trial data or through reports of so-called adverse events submitted by the agency by consumers and healthcare professionals. It's not always possible, it seems, to know that those adverse events are directly caused by a medication. But if the FDA identifies a serious concern, it can require a drug company to update its product's labeling, restrict its use, or in rare cases, remove it completely from the market, meaning the drugs are withdrawn after, of course, a prior full approval. That's black box labeling. So, not great really. That's 1 in 5 pre-approved drugs over all the time the FDA has been around. 1 in 5 are found to have serious unknown side effects resulting in a black label. Now the FDA through the 1990s has now shifted from being entirely taxpayer funded to now being funded primarily from the very organizations it is supposed to be regulating. Now, before the User Act was approved, about 21%, as I've said, of medications were removed from the market or had new black box warnings, as compared to 27% after user funding was introduced. So an increase from 1 in 5 to nearly, 1 in 3 medications now have serious unknown side effects or were withdrawn after a prior full FDA approval. And sometimes these side effects occur years after the widespread use of the drugs themselves. To assess new drugs for safety and effectiveness, the FDA relies on pre-market drug testing and, of course, clinical trials. Now, most of the clinical trials involve fewer than 1,000 patients studied over a period of 6 months or less, making it difficult, it seems, to detect safety issues that might be identified once more patients use the drug over a longer time period. Now, the researchers also identified characteristics of drugs that were most likely to be associated with safety concerns, including biologic therapies and drugs that were approved through the FDA's very own accelerated approval pathway. I'll come back to that. An increase, though, of 7% of black box warnings might not sound a lot, but consider this. A drug's circulation could be measured in terms of doses, and perhaps a successful drug meeting a need could be prescribed to, 500,000 patients? An unknown side effect could then affect a small proportion of those, but the bigger the number of doses, the bigger the number of side effects. So what about a drug prescribed to billions? Now, some potential reasons that more adverse effects are coming to light after full FDA approval include senior FDA officials overturning scientific recommendations, a lower burden of proof for medication approval, and apparently more clinical data in new drug applications coming from foreign clinical trial sites that require additional time to assess in an environment where regulators are rushing to meet tight deadlines. These are some signs then that the pendulum may be swinging too far in the direction of manufacturers. Also, don't forget, the drug only has to prove it's better than doing nothing. It's only being measured at the end of the day against a placebo, not against a range of competing options, something the big pharma companies simply don't want to fund. But that's not the only difference we can see from the data from the FDA since the introduction of user funding. From an article in Yukon Today published on May the 21st, that's 2021, the University of Connecticut, dated August 2021, the article claims that close to 45% of the FDA's budget now comes from those user fees paid by big pharma companies seeking approval for medical devices or drugs. It gets a lot more, or can I say cloudy, when you look at human drug regulation, where 65% of the FDA budget for this now comes directly from big pharmaceutical companies themselves. So I have a question. How can an agency regulate an industry that's actually funding the agency and, of course, assisting in its setting its goals? It's a basic and fair question, I think. We know that changing the funding source has affected the end result. Black box warnings went up by nearly 7%. Now, the author of the Yukon article states this: as a pharmacist and a medication and dietary supplement safety researcher, I understand that the vital role of the FDA plays in ensuring the safety of medications and medical devices. But I, along with many others, now wonder, was this move a clever win-win for the manufacturers and the public? Or did it place patient safety second to corporate profitability? It's also clear that the approval process for drugs since the introduction of user fees has become much quicker. Since Big Pharma was giving the money for the drug approval process in terms of paying user fees, they wanted something for their money. So there was indeed a trade-off in the form of performance measures that the FDA has to meet. It had to agree target dates for approval deadlines. Also, the FDA is quicker and more willing to discuss what it wants to see in an application with manufacturers. It offers also clearer guidance from manufacturers on how to gain approval, and it sets approval deadlines agreed with those pharmaceutical companies who pay for this part of the process. Now, in 1987, it took 29 months for approvals to be given, but in 2018, this had been shortened to just 13 months. First-time approvals have risen from 38% in 2005 to 61% in 2018, and many gain approval in just under 8 months' time. Now that's quite a staggering change. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has seen the FDA provide emergency use authorization for potential treatments in a matter of weeks, not months. The infrastructure and capacity to review the available information so rapidly is in some part, or in large part really, to the funding from those user fees. The user fee, though, is not the only point of conflict of interest. The ever-revolving door to and from Big Pharma and the FDA continues unabated in terms of employment opportunities. Researchers have found that 27% of FDA regulators left the organization to work in high-paying pharma jobs. So these regulators who understand the process are well sought after by the big pharma companies, but you must question whether decisions whilst working at the FDA are in some way impacted by the thought of a future career for the big pharma companies. Now, according to MedPage Today, Big Pharma organises regular get-togethers at plush hotels, all expenses paid trips to mingle with the regulators at conferences. Entry fees are paid by those leading pharmaceutical companies, and these run into tens of thousands of dollars. To attend these invitation-only events with the FDA and NIH officials present. Now, emails have been tracking one particular organisation, most of which track correspondence amongst founders of an organisation called Impact Academics, NIH researchers and FDA officials. These raise serious questions about the way in which federal regulators interact with the pharmaceutical companies themselves, those that they are supposed to regulate. Entry to these meetings was secured by an annual fee that ranged as high as $35,000. But the emails raised concerns about a possible pay-for-play arrangement in which drug companies were well, able to buy access to invitation-only meetings where they could then meet with FDA officials and possibly influence FDA policy regarding approvals and regulations of analgesics. And Michael Corone, this is MD, Director of the Health Research Group of the watchdog group Public Citizen. He said this: the whole picture is a troubling one and it warrants an independent investigation, said Corone, who has seen those emails going backwards and forwards. Now, one clinical trial initiative, a spin-off from these get-togethers, is called enriched enrollment, which allows drug companies to reject people in the clinical trials who are non-responsive or have had an adverse reaction to the drugs on the clinical trial. Now, this would in effect make the drug seem less, well, dangerous and possibly more effective in the clinical trial data itself. Now, this of course speeds up the approval process, and because Big Pharma is paying for the clinical trials, of course they support this very greatly, and there are many questions though raised concerning the impartiality of those trial results. Again, the measure against which every drug is judged as effective is against the placebo, meaning, well, measured against doing absolutely nothing. Why is Big Pharma allowed to reject patients in the trial who have had an adverse reaction or effectively no reaction to the drug at all? Now, surely by rejecting adverse reactions, dangerous in the short or long term, or removing anyone that has no reaction to the drug at all is simply, well, is that cheating? Would this be allowed or acceptable if Big Pharma were not paying for the clinical trial? Good question, I think. There are issues as well over payments made to the clinical trials FDA's physician advisors. Let me explain. Before drugs and treatments are approved for use, a panel of advisors meets to discuss the science and the data and vote to recommend or reject an approval. Now, each panel advisor must disclose any conflicts of interest, but it is a well-known fact that panel members will receive future payments and gifts if the drugs are approved. Now, this is an obvious conflict of interest in each and every review. Now, the Science magazine journal found that from 107 panel advisors examined, 40 of them had received post hoc earnings or research support to the tune of $10,000 or more, 26 of which had received $100,000 or more, and 6 of that number received more than $1 million. If you're not shocked, then you should be, or perhaps must be, a panel member. According to MedPage today, in late April, the FDA's Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee reviewed 6 accelerated approvals. I told you I'd come back to this. A provisional pathway, apparently, involving a group of cancer immunotherapies where clinical trials had failed to confirm the drug's extended survival rates or even improved quality of life. And yet, in 4 out of the 6 cases, the advisory committee voted to keep the accelerated approvals intact, even though the drugs confirmed or concerned could not be shown to improve the patient's situations at all. Still not shocked? Well, I could go on, but I'm running out of time. Many observers don't fully appreciate how the FDA has taken a position that is frankly indefensible. The agency does not guarantee that drugs that come to the US market actually help Americans live longer or better lives beyond what could be achieved without using the drugs. Now, Big Pharma, in my opinion, has an undue influence over clinical trials since they pay for them, and the dubious ability to positively influence the trial results, one way or the other, is simply wrong. The combined effect is the worst of all possible worlds. We don't know if drugs work. We don't know even the side effects. Some of them might have been hidden or ignored. And the companies can charge massive prices for drugs that simply aren't more effective than doing, well, simply nothing. Big Pharma has too many links with the FDA in terms of the regulators themselves, and I have no reason to believe that the situation in other countries is any less conflicted, and that could result in serious implications for the peoples of the world. It's not just about user fees either, but the movement of regulators to and from the big pharma positions in these companies. And the ex gratia payments to regulators creates an obvious conflict of interest as much as the regulator concerned about how the acceptance or rejection of an FDA approval affects his or her long-term career opportunities. Any regulator will tell you that the regulation process must be independent, seen to be independent, and fiercely independent of any or all circumstances. And that is clearly and demonstrably not the case for the FDA, and there is no reason to believe that other medical regulatory bodies around the world have not similar conflicts to resolve. We must have clarity and independence in bodies as important as the FDA, and we simply don't have it. You've been watching Get to the Point. Big Pharma is corrupting the regulators. My name is James Cordwell.